In our last video, we talked about self-construals and the fact that people can use relational self-construals when thinking about themselves. So they may define themselves in terms of their one-on-one relationships. Now we're going to look at the idea of relational assimilation. The self-concept is malleable. It can change. The way that we think about ourselves changes from one moment to another and from one situation to another. So you are a different person and you think about yourself differently when you're interacting with your parents than when you're interacting with your friends, right? So we are different when we're around different people. Assimilation is the act of becoming more like something or picking up its characteristics. Contrast is becoming less like something or suppressing some of its characteristics. Is it possible that we use assimilation and contrast when developing our self-concepts or when changing our self-concepts? In another set of studies by Shira Gabriel and her colleagues, they asked this question. The title of the study was "A Friend is a Present That You Give to Yourself." They wanted to ask if our self-concepts shift to be more like our friends. They decided that this likely depends on attachment style or your propensity to avoid intimacy. They assumed that non-avoidant people may become more like their friends, so they may assimilate. But they hypothesized that avoidant people might become less like their friends. They may show contrast effects. In study 1, they had participants complete the study on computer in 2 separate sessions. In the first session, they provided the name of a good friend. In the second session, they came back and they completed the manipulation. So they were asked to write about their good friend or about activities they engaged in on the previous day. So basically write about a friend versus a control. And then they rated how much they liked themselves. In the control condition, what do you think we'll see in terms of how much low and high avoidant people like themselves? Not that different. It looks like low avoidant people maybe like themselves just a little bit more. But what about after they've written about a good friend? Is it possible that low avoidant people assimilate that friend into their self-concept and therefore like themselves better? And is it possible that high avoidant people contrast that friend from their self-concept and therefore like themselves less? That appears to be what they found after writing about a good friend. Low avoidant people liked themselves somewhat more, and high avoidant people liked themselves somewhat less. After thinking about a good friend, low avoidant people seem to assimilate that liking to themselves, and high avoidant people seem to contrast that liking, making them like themselves less. In their second study, they also completed the study on the computer, and then to provide the name of a friend they are ambivalent about. Ambivalent means that you're unsure if you like them. Maybe there are times when you really like them, but times when you really don't, or certain aspects of them that you really like and certain aspects that you don't. They were asked to identify a friend that they just weren't sure about. Sometimes they liked them, sometimes they didn't. And in the manipulation, they were asked to write about their ambivalent friend. In the control condition, they were asked to write about their activities on the previous day. And again, they looked at self-liking. Do you think low avoidant people and high avoidant people differ in terms of self-liking in the control condition? Yes, there was a little bit of a difference here. Low avoidant people liked themselves a little bit more than high avoidant people. But after writing about an ambivalent friend, what happens? They found that writing about an ambivalent friend made people who were low in avoidance like themselves a little bit less. They assimilated those questionable feelings, right? But people who are high in avoidance liked that friend more. So they contrasted those inconsistent feelings or those unsure feelings and made themselves like themselves better. In study 3, they also completed the study on a computer. And this time they wrote about a friend that has both positive and negative traits. And they were asked to either write about their friend's positive traits or their friend's negative traits. So everyone had to provide a friend that had both positive and negative, so that we know that the difference here is not about the friends you identify, but rather the fact that you're writing about their positive traits versus writing about their negative traits. And then again, they looked at self-liking. When they wrote about disliked aspects of their friend, who do you think felt better about themselves? If we're assuming that low avoidance people are going to assimilate, they should like themselves less, then high avoidance people should contrast. So they should push away the disliked aspects of their friend and like themselves better. And that is what they found. People who were low in avoidance tended to assimilate those disliked aspects of their friend and therefore liked themselves less. But high avoidance people tended to contrast and therefore pushed away the disliked aspects of the friend. Now, if they were asked to write about the liked aspects of the friend, what do you think happened? It should be the reverse, right? Because low avoidant people should assimilate liked aspects and therefore like themselves more. But high avoidant people should contrast liked aspects and therefore dislike themselves, right? They should like themselves less. And that's what they found. Again, merely by asking people to think about the disliked or the liked aspects of their friends, they could change those people's perceptions of themselves. Finally, in this fourth study, they completed a bogus personality profile. They were told that their score on this personality profile means that they're going to experience very little success in the future. They're going to fail at a lot of things. Or they're told that they're going to have a lot of success in the future. They're going to do really well. Then they were asked to describe a friend of their own choosing. The primary outcome was the similarity of that friend to their own ideal and feared self. So is that friend similar to who you want to be? Or is that friend similar to who you're scared you will be? In the no threat condition, there was essentially no difference. Low and high avoidance people didn't really make a big difference between their ideal and feared self. In the threat condition, however, what do you think happens? In the threat condition, we see that low avoidance people are much more likely to choose a friend that was similar to their ideal self. So they strategically use the friends that they think of to make themselves feel better. However, high avoidant people tended to choose someone that was closer to their feared self. So again, if they tend to contrast people, thinking about someone who's closer to their feared self should make them feel better about themselves. In summary, there was evidence for assimilation in the study. Non-avoidant people liked the self better when thinking of good friends or positive traits. But there was also evidence for contrast. Avoidance liked the self better when thinking of ambivalent friends or negative traits. Both non-avoidance and avoidance strategically pick the friends that will help them feel better after a threat. So we looked at relational assimilation. Is it also possible to have collective assimilation? Can people also use their groups? If our self-concept can be affected by our relational ties, it should also be affected by our collective ties. Rather than focusing on dyadic or two-person relationships, we're going to need to focus on groups. Those who are higher in collective self-construal should be more likely to take on characteristics of their group members. Shira Gabriel and one of her colleagues conducted a study called Becoming a Vampire Without Being Bitten. In this study, they had them first complete the collective self-construal scale, and then they read a passage from either the book Twilight or the book Harry Potter. Then they had participants complete something called an implicit associations test. You were asked to do an implicit associations test just before this video. They assessed participants' implicit association to vampires versus wizards. And I'm sorry, that was not one of the options at the IAT site that I sent you to. Then, after doing that, they measured participants' self-reports of wizard-like or vampire-like traits. For example, how sharp are your teeth? Presumably, people who had more vampire-like traits would report that their teeth are somewhat sharper. So now we're looking at differences here. After reading the Harry Potter passage, do people feel more similar to wizards, which would be low down here, or more similar to vampires, which would be up high? And after reading about Twilight, are they more similar to vampires? Again, that's up high. Or more similar to wizards, and that's down low. And we have low collective self-construal and high collective self-construal. They found that after reading a passage about Harry Potter, people who were high in collective self-construal showed a stronger association to wizard traits. But after reading Twilight, this effect was reversed. High collective self-construal felt more similar to vampires. And here is their self-report score. Do they see themselves as being more like Harry Potter or wizards, or do they see themselves as being more like vampires? I have pointy teeth. So after reading the Harry Potter story, those with high collective self-construal felt more like wizards. After reading Twilight, those with high collective self-construal felt more like vampires. Even when the collective is composed of fictional characters, like they were in this case, a collective of vampires or a collective of wizards, participants who have greater collective self-construals tend to take on more characteristics of that group.